The story of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey is one of the most controversial and polarizing true crime cases in modern history, capturing global attention and raising serious questions about justice, corruption, and truth. This is a detailed recounting of the events that make up their story. Stephen Avery was born in 1962 in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, where his family owned and operated a salvage yard. The Averys were not a well-regarded family in the small community, often described as outsiders, and this reputation seemed to follow Stephen throughout his life. Despite these challenges, Stephen led an ordinary life until 1985, when his world was turned upside down. In July 1985, Penny Beertson, jogger, was brutally attacked and sexually assaulted while running along the beach. Based on her identification, which was later questioned due to its circumstances, Stephen Avery was arrested and charged with the crime. Avery insisted on his innocence, presenting alibis and evidence that should have exonerated him. However, he was convicted largely based on eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. For 18 years, Stephen Avery remained behind bars, steadfast in his claim of innocence. In 2003, a remarkable breakthrough occurred when the Wisconsin Innocence Project took on Avery's case. Advanced DNA testing, which was not available at the time of his conviction, conclusively proved that Avery was not the perpetrator. Instead, the evidence pointed to Gregory Allen, a man who had been a known suspect at the time of Avery's original trial. Allen had a history of similar crimes, but law enforcement overlooked him in favor of Avery. Stephen Avery was exonerated and released from prison in September 2003. After his release, Avery filed a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County and several law enforcement officials, claiming they had deliberately mishandled his case. This lawsuit put immense pressure on the county and cast a shadow over the law enforcement community, particularly those involved in the original investigation. Avery's release was celebrated as a victory for justice, but it was short-lived. In 2005, just 2 years after his release, Stephen Avery became embroiled in another criminal case, this time involving the disappearance and murder of 25-year-old photographer Teresa Halbach. Halbach had visited the Avery salvage yard on October 31, 2005, to photograph a vehicle for a local magazine. This was her last known appointment before she vanished. When Teresa was reported missing, investigators turned their attention to Stephen Avery. Evidence began to mount against him in shocking ways. Teresa's Toyota RAV4 was found partially hidden on the Avery property. Bloodstains in the car matched Stephen's DNA, and her charred remains were discovered in a burned pit near his trailer. Investigators also claimed to find Halbach's car key in Avery's bedroom, with only his DNA present on it. The case took an even darker turn when Avery's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, became implicated. Brendan, who had cognitive impairments and was described as having a low IQ, was interrogated by police without a lawyer or guardian present. During a highly controversial questioning session, Brendan confessed to participating in Teresa's rape and murder alongside Stephen. However, his confession raised immediate concerns. It appeared to be coerced, with Brendan providing details that seemed to be fed to him by investigators rather than recalled from memory. For example, when asked how Teresa was killed, Brendan initially guessed incorrectly until officers suggested a different method. The prosecution's case against Stephen Avery relied heavily on the physical evidence found on his property, while Brendan's confession played a critical role in solidifying public perception of their guilt. The trials were separate but intertwined, with media coverage painting Avery as a dangerous repeat offender and Brendan as an accomplice. Both men were convicted. Stephen Avery received life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Brendan Dassey also received a life sentence, with eligibility for parole in 2048. Despite the convictions, significant doubts about the integrity of the investigation and trial process have persisted. Avery's defense team argued that evidence was planted to frame him, pointing to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, which had been excluded from directly handling the case due to conflicts of interest related to Avery's lawsuit. Nevertheless, officers from Manitowoc were involved in key discoveries, such as Teresa's car key in Avery's bedroom. For Brendan, his confession became a focal point of controversy. Experts in false confessions have since reviewed the interrogation tapes, concluding that Brendan was manipulated into admitting guilt without fully understanding the gravity of his statements. His defense argued that Brendan's cognitive impairments made him. The case of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey remains an ongoing saga, with legal battles still being fought and new questions emerging even years after their convictions. The story, as it stands, is far from over. Following the release of Making a Murderer in 2015, there was a surge of public interest and advocacy on behalf of Avery and Dassey. The series not only highlighted inconsistencies in the investigation, but also brought global attention to issues like coerced confessions, prosecutorial misconduct, and the possibility of evidence tampering. Viewers around the world became divided, some convinced of their guilt, others passionately believing they were framed. Brendan Dassey's case has been particularly heartbreaking for many. His confession, widely criticized by legal experts and psychologists, has become a textbook example of how vulnerable individuals can be manipulated in high-stakes interrogations. In 2016, after federal Judge William Duffin overturned his conviction, Brendan's supporters were optimistic. Judge Duffin ruled that Brendan's confession was involuntary and violated his constitutional rights. The ruling briefly paved the way for Brendan's release, but the state of Wisconsin, led by Attorney General Brad Schimmel, appealed the decision. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately sided with the state, reinstating Brendan's conviction in a narrow 4-3 decision. The U.S. Supreme Court later declined to hear his case, effectively leaving Brendan's conviction intact. Stephen Avery's fight for justice has been equally challenging. In 2016, Kathleen Zellner, a prominent wrongful conviction attorney, took on Avery's case, promising to uncover new evidence and expose flaws in the original investigation. Zellner has since filed multiple motions, presenting new forensic evidence and alternative suspects. Her team has pointed to questionable forensic practices, such as the alleged contamination of DNA evidence and the possibility that key pieces of evidence, like Teresa Halbach's car key, were planted by law enforcement. Zellner has also raised doubts about the timeline of events presented by the prosecution, suggesting that other individuals with access to the Avery salvage yard were not adequately investigated. Despite these efforts, Avery's appeals have been repeatedly denied by Wisconsin courts. Zellner continues to work on his case, filing new motions as more forensic testing methods become available. However, the legal process is slow, and the path to overturning a conviction is fraught with obstacles. The Avery and Dassey case has also had a profound impact on the legal and cultural landscape. It has inspired changes in how interrogations are conducted, particularly with juveniles and individuals with cognitive impairments. Advocates for criminal justice reform have used the case as a rallying point to push for greater accountability in law enforcement and prosecutorial practices. The case has also underscored the importance of unbiased journalism and the ethical responsibilities of true crime storytelling. For the families involved, the pain of this case lingers. Teresa Halbach's family has expressed frustration with the media attention surrounding Avery and Dassey, feeling that Teresa's memory has been overshadowed by the controversy. They have steadfastly maintained their belief in the original verdicts and have asked the public to remember Teresa as a kind, vibrant young woman whose life was tragically cut short. As of now, Stephen Avery remains incarcerated at the Waupun Correctional Institution, and Brendan Dassey is at the Oshkosh Correctional Institution. Both continue to fight for their freedom, holding on to hope that one day their cases will be re-examined with fresh eyes. The story of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey serves as a chilling reminder of the complexities of the justice system. Whether they are guilty or innocent, the questions raised by their case will likely be debated for years to come. For some, their story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of corruption and systemic failure. For others, it is a testament to the resilience of individuals who refuse to give up in the face of overwhelming odds. What remains certain is that their case has left an indelible mark on the legal system and the true crime genre, ensuring it will not be forgotten anytime soon. The ongoing struggle for justice in the case of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey not only reflects the flaws and intricacies of the American legal system, but also exposes how media, public opinion, and power dynamics can influence perceptions of guilt and innocence. In recent years, Kathleen Zellner, Avery's attorney, has worked tirelessly to identify and present new evidence that could cast doubt on the convictions. Her investigations have brought attention to details that were either overlooked or dismissed during the original trial. Zellner has suggested that key evidence was mishandled, tampered with, or fabricated, and she has raised significant questions about the integrity of those involved in the case's investigation. For example, she has highlighted inconsistencies in the way Teresa Halbach's remains were handled, and has suggested that the discovery of her vehicle and Avery's alleged involvement may have been staged. One of the most significant aspects Zellner continues to challenge is the DNA evidence used against Avery. The blood found in Halbach's car was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but Zellner argues that the lack of preservative EDTA in the blood samples raises questions about their origin. Avery's defense has long contended that this evidence could have been planted, especially given that a vial of Avery's blood from his 1985 case was stored in a county evidence locker, a vial that appeared to have been tampered with when inspected later. Another critical point of Zellner's investigation focuses on the bones attributed to Teresa Halbach. Zellner has argued that the state's handling of the bone evidence raises doubts about the prosecution's narrative. Some of Halbach's remains were found outside of Avery's property in a nearby quarry, suggesting a potential alternative crime scene that was not fully explored. This finding, according to Zellner, undermines the prosecution's claim that Halbach was killed and cremated solely on Avery's property. For Brendan Dassey, the focus remains on the confession that played a pivotal role in his conviction. Numerous experts, including psychologists and legal analysts, have condemned the interrogation methods used, stating that Brendan's rights were violated and that his statements were coerced. The recorded interviews reveal a teenager who was confused and eager to please the investigators, often providing answers they seemed to suggest rather than recounting his own recollection of events. Brendan's defenders argue that his low IQ and lack of understanding of the legal process made him especially vulnerable to manipulation. Despite the mounting evidence and public support, the legal system has proven resistant to change in this case. Brendan's appeals, including the petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, have been denied, leaving him with limited options to seek relief. Stephen Avery's appeals, while still active, face constant rejection in Wisconsin courts, with judges often citing procedural barriers or ruling that the new evidence presented does not meet the high standard required to overturn a conviction. The public's interest in the case has remained strong, with advocacy groups and individuals campaigning for Avery and Dassey's release. Petitions calling for new trials or executive clemency have garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures, but official action has yet to materialize. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers has stated that he would only consider clemency applications submitted through the proper channels, and so far, neither Avery nor Dassey has met the criteria for such consideration. Meanwhile, the legacy of making a murderer continues to evolve. While the documentary series sparked widespread awareness and advocacy, it has also faced criticism for allegedly omitting certain evidence and presenting a biased perspective. Critics argue that the series painted an overly sympathetic picture of Avery and Dassey while downplaying key aspects of the prosecution's case. Despite these critiques, the series succeeded in fostering a broader conversation about the criminal justice system and the potential for wrongful convictions. The Avery and Dassey case has also inspired other media projects and investigations. Numerous podcasts, books, and independent documentaries have delved deeper into the case, each offering their interpretations of the events. These works have introduced alternative suspects, re-examined the evidence, and provided platforms for experts to analyze the proceedings. The case has become a symbol of the fight against systemic issues such as police misconduct, false confessions, and the mishandling of evidence. For those directly involved, the emotional toll has been immense. Teresa Halbach's family, in particular, has struggled with the ongoing attention and scrutiny. They have expressed frustration with efforts to portray Avery and Dassey as victims, firmly believing in the jury's verdict and the justice system's alibi. The case of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey has undeniably become one of the most enduring and controversial criminal cases in the history of American jurisprudence. Even as time passes, the questions surrounding their convictions continue to spark debate, not just in legal circles but among the general public as well. The lasting impact of their case has created ripples in both the legal system and popular culture, highlighting the complexities of criminal investigations, the potential for wrongful convictions, and the ways in which media can shape public opinion. Despite ongoing legal setbacks, there is still hope that new evidence or breakthroughs could change the course of Avery and Dassey's cases. Zellner, Avery's attorney, has not given up on her campaign to exonerate her client. Over the years, she has continued to bring forward fresh evidence, often shedding new light on the investigation and challenging the forensic practices used in their conviction. While the courts have remained largely resistant to her arguments, Zellner's persistence is a reminder of how tireless advocates for the wrongfully convicted can challenge the very system that failed them in the first place. For Avery, who has spent over 15 years in prison for a crime many believe he did not commit, the fight for justice is deeply personal. He remains adamant about his innocence, and his case has sparked a nationwide conversation about the possibility of law enforcement corruption, the mishandling of evidence, and the human cost of systemic failure. Even as new leads continue to emerge and alternative suspects are suggested, the question of whether justice will ever be fully served for Stephen Avery remains an open one. His battle for freedom is not just about clearing his name, but about making sure no one else suffers a similar fate. Brendan Dassey's case, in many ways, has been equally tragic, if not more so. At just 16 years old, with intellectual disabilities, Dassey was interrogated without legal counsel or a parent present. His confession, which many believe was coerced and fabricated by law enforcement, has been a focal point for critics of the criminal justice system. False confessions, particularly from vulnerable individuals, have become a key concern for legal reformers. And Dassey's case has highlighted the need for better protections for minors and those with cognitive impairments during police interrogations. Although Dassey's conviction was overturned by a federal judge in 2016, the decision was reversed by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and Dassey remains behind bars today, still hoping for justice and fighting to prove his innocence. In recent years, the case has also been a lightning rod for broader conversations about criminal justice reform. The wrongful conviction of Stephen Avery in 1985 and his subsequent rearrest for a crime he may not have committed in 2005 has raised fundamental questions about the integrity of the justice system, particularly in cases involving police misconduct, prosecutorial overreach, and the way that evidence is handled. Advocates for criminal justice reform, particularly those focused on wrongful convictions, have pointed to Avery and Dassey's cases as proof of the need for systemic change. Their story has prompted calls for reforming police practices, particularly the way interrogations are conducted, and for the implementation of more rigorous standards for handling and testing forensic evidence. The Avery and Dassey case has also contributed to the growing movement calling for the abolition of juvenile life sentences, particularly for those convicted of crimes they may have been coerced into committing. The fact that Dassey was convicted based on a confession many believe he was pressured into giving has led to a broader debate about the appropriateness of sentencing young people to life in prison without the possibility of parole, especially in cases where the defendant's mental capacity and understanding of the legal process are in question. In addition to legal reforms, the case has become a point of contention in the world of media and true crime documentaries. Making a Murderer, which chronicled the story of Avery and Dassey, not only sparked a massive outpouring of support from the public, but also ignited a fierce backlash. Critics of the series argue that it sensationalized the case, focusing too heavily on the narrative of a wrongful conviction while glossing over key pieces of evidence that supported the prosecution's case. Others argue that the series played a critical role in bringing attention to the flaws in the investigation and legal proceedings, pointing out that the documentary allowed for the public to engage with the story in ways that traditional media outlets did not. Since the release of Making a Murderer, several other documentaries, podcasts, and news specials have explored the case from different angles, further complicating the public's perception. In the end, the case of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey remains unresolved. With each passing year, new legal challenges and potential evidence surface, but the chances of their exoneration grow slimmer as the legal system remains steadfast in its decisions. Whether they will ever find freedom or remain behind bars, their case will continue to spark debates about the flaws of the criminal justice system, the power of media in shaping public opinion, and the need for accountability in law enforcement. It is a story that raises profound questions about guilt, innocence, and the lengths to which the justice system must go to ensure fairness and transparency. For now, the search for truth and justice remains ongoing, as both men continue to fight for their freedom.